American views on the military use of the policies are every bit as divided as they are in Roe v. Wade. That is, if you look at the way in which woke instruction takes place in the service academies and so forth, and you look at the way in which the political divides have taken place, the American military has been heavily compromised. There's this battle over vaccines, and the current administration may, in fact, dismiss as many as 40,000 people for refusing to take a shot, which in my view is actually quite dangerous and has become more so over time, so that the enlistments in the United States military are down at this particular point in time, just as the willingness of people to serve as policemen is down in many places in the United States. Because what happens is if you go in there, you're afraid that you are going to be subject to these same kinds of withering attacks that have taken place with respect to the abortion issues. The right on this position tends to talk. It's more intellectual at this time, doesn't take pretty much to the streets. The left is the other way around. And we have a political leadership in Washington now of Biden, which is much further to the left than anything that we've imagined. And so what happens is, if I were Australia, I would be very unhappy about what I think to be the kind of loss of moral purpose and unified strength that characterized American foreign policy for many, many years. So what you're seeing in abortion is just one of many, many issues on which this kind of decline in America is starting to take place. How one starts to turn about, I cannot always say. It's certainly not through the highly imperfect Mr. Donald Trump. I mean, having a Biden-Trump election in 2024 would be an unmitigated disaster in my situation. But what we have to do is to step back from the current situation and figure out where we've gone wrong in order to lower the heat on one thing, to improve the unity of this particular country, and to make sure that we don't get one side treating the other side as though they're pariahs, white supremacists, or something else. So what I'm reporting here is a very uncomfortable situation. I'm in academics. Thus far, mercifully, I've escaped any direct exposure to this. But I can tell you, more and more of my contemporaries, even people 10 years younger than me, are now retiring from academics, and they all give the same explanation. It was wonderful when we were at the peak of our career that we had a kind of golden age of intellectual earnestness on the one hand and genuine toleration on the other. And the current environment is simply so intolerable. I would rather retire than be faced by younger colleagues, and particularly by graduate students who have complete impatience with every kind of rational discourse or everything nice about Western civilization that I was prepared to say. So what you're seeing in abortion is not atypical to what is happening in the United States. Spiro Agnew had a famous phrase called the silent majority, and it wasn't silent, and it probably wasn't a majority when he said it, but my own sense in the United States is that the left is now in power. It senses it will lose much of its power in the November election, so it's going for broke in an effort when it has these slender majorities to convert all their preferences into law. And the more they do that, the more likely it is that the elections are going to shift pretty emphatically in the other direction. And the last thing you want to have is to move from one extreme to another. And it's extremely difficult to sort of lower the temperature and to increase the discourse. I went into academics because I like to talk, right? I didn't go into academics because I like to pick, what?
Ideas matter.
Ideas matter. I mean, and I've been consistently engaged. It's the only thing I've ever done in my life. There was a period of genuine uncertainty about all these things when I first entered teaching in 1968. I mean, lots of complications going on with Vietnam and the domestic stuff at home, but that was child's play to what we're seeing today. And what I reported, I think, is really very ominous. If decent people in the senior ranks start to retire because they can't take the heat, it's going to make these institutions more radical than they've ever been. And if the elite institutions in this country become all hard left, Lord knows what's going to happen to the country when the rest of us wake up and decide that we just cannot continue to live in this fashion. So it's all very tense at this particular point. Roe is a symptom. It is not the only illustration of this division.
That's a valuable insight. One of our former High Court judges commented recently that modern elites do not demand toleration, they demand total capitulation. You have to, that it's no longer tolerance, it's no longer just accepting other people's differences. You actually have to celebrate them now, even if you vehemently disagree with them. To stand back for a moment, to just explore this a bit more, we just had a federal election in Australia. And as a former legislator, I looked on it, I thought the country is in graver danger than at any time since the 1930s, militarily and frankly economically as well. And yet those issues did not rate the internal wars, the identity politics, the issues of the day as one Australian pitted themselves against another and another and another and another. It's not like the old days of the left versus right. There's identity groups everywhere pushing their barrows. It raises the question as to whether or not we are becoming ungovernable in the West.
Well, what you raise is a very profound question. I mean, there may be a reaction against all of this. I think there will be in the United States. But even if there's a reaction, what does that mean? It means that 60% of the people will now essentially mean that the more conservative forces or the more centrist forces of the United States take over. But it doesn't mean that the 40% who used to rule are going to remain silent. There are all sorts of levers that they can pull so that even if the forces of government tend to shift, it will make a large difference, but it won't restore kind of respect and tranquility to the United States in the way in which you used to do it. The argument used to be, I used to say something, you think it's wrong. I could never stop your counter speech. You would go ahead. But now if I say something that you disagree with me, you want to fire me from my position, you want to put me in jail, you want to bounce me off of Twitter. And what typically happens in these particular cases is the guys who want to do the bouncing are as often and maybe even more often wrong than the people whom they want to bounce. And so what happens is we sort of have, instead of a sign of a collective agnosticism about what's right and wrong and leaving it to factions to argue the thing out, what we do is we have a kind of an orthodoxy, which is so militant that it thinks that there's no restrictions on the means that it can use to advance what it regards as indubitable ends. And it's that symptom that sort of pervades all of these things. And I have to say in the United States, I think Biden in many ways is worse on this issue than was Trump. My view about Trump is he's a loudmouth and a bore on many issues. And he unnecessarily divided the country, and on issues of trade, like, he was downright stupid in many cases, but he was mainly bluster. The problem about Biden, he's less bluster, but in terms of his actions, he's much more dictatorial than Trump ever was in terms of his willingness to use executive power. In fact, I'm suing the man right now because what he did is he took every Trump appointee who was elected to various kinds of advisory boards, of which there may be 50 in government, and he fired them all unilaterally. It had never been done by any president before. And in my view, there's no authorization for him to do it. These are not his employees. These are independent people. It's a checks and balances system. It's not an administrative system where you're my attorney general, so I could fire you if you don't want to do what I'm doing. So we have that kind of concentration there. Recently, he has announced he may declare a climate emergency. And what's he going to do? Ban exports of fossil fuels, stop fracking in the United States? He won't win on that because the Supreme Court, in one of its extremely important decisions having to do with West Virginia, that there's limits to how much you can impose through an administrative agency or through an executive order that can fundamentally transform the way in which this country does business. And so the Obama administration wanted to essentially take a position about having the best systems of emission reduction when you start to talk about a piece of equipment and use that to force people to have huge amounts of energy generated by solar and wind power, even when it was not sustainable. And the Supreme Court said you couldn't do it. Well, Biden is trying to do the same thing now through executive order. So now let's go back to what you said at the beginning and put the two pieces together, all right? Which is, you said, this is a case where legislative power takes place first. Here, what's happening is we're not talking about the protection of individual rights as we are in free speech cases. What you're talking about is making major changes in political structure by unilateral action of a president who's exceeding his constitutional authority. And so that's a real danger and a real menace. And the practice was done a little bit under George Bush. It was done a little bit more under Barack Obama, a little bit more under Donald Trump, though not that much. But Biden has simply exploded this far beyond any of his three immediate predecessors. So if you want to find reasons to be worried about the United States, your issue about the balance of powers, we're a presidential system, you're a parliamentary system, right? Well, our presidential system is getting out of whack. Your parliamentary system doesn't have quite that problem because you want to get rid of a government that's not impeachment, right? It's a vote of confidence. Well, you can't use a vote of confidence in a presidential system, right? It gives the Congress too much power. That's why impeachment's a much narrower offense. And our system is starting to show the strains. Perhaps under these circumstances, a parliamentary system may do better, although obviously we're not going to be able, after these long times, to switch America to that kind of system.